these little things before we would stand on the high holidays, before we would sit. Congregation was way ahead of me. They stood up, and I had a little something I wanted to say. So I said, if you want, you can remain standing, but I'm still going to say what I want to say. So that's like us. I don't care if you close the ark. We're going to keep praying, okay? Just want you to know that. Anyways, last night we had a very interesting conversation on Zoom after Kabbalat Shabbat about a phrase about, I don't really want to say the phrase because it doesn't sound very good, but it was a Yiddish phrase. And it was to sprinkle a dash of food in Yiddish. Anyways, it was a very fun conversation that we had about Yiddish. And it turns out it's a very good introduction to the sermon that I want to give this morning, because I want to teach you a Yiddish phrase that maybe you know already, maybe you don't know, but I don't know if you've ever heard of the phrase verbissene. Yes. Yeah, just by saying the word you can tell. As an adjective, verbissene means embittered, sullen. Can even mean mean. As a noun, it really means a sourpuss. So you may have met somebody who is a verbissene punim, right? Where you can just look at them and you know that they are bitter about something. And there are some people that are like that in life, you know. There are people who walk through life and the world is against them. Everything, the sky is falling constantly. I remember there was a Saturday Night Live skit with a character named Debbie the Downer. And Debbie the Downer, no reference to Debbies. No Debbies in our congregation. But there was a character, and you knew it was coming because there was a sound that went. So verbissene is Yiddish, but there was a sound. It went like this. Wah, wah. Right? And you knew that was going to be the introduction to when Debbie the Downer had some way of turning this fun conversation into something just terrible. And we know that when we encounter somebody who is bitter, who is angry, it rubs off on us. Right? You know that bitterness is actually contagious. And so we'll see a variety of locations throughout our society in which we are instructed to remove the toxic people from our lives, right? Because toxicity is also contagious. And this idea that a person can be down and then extend that sadness to us is something we understand. And so we see in this morning's parsha something remarkable, and that is the Mei Meriva, the bitter waters. And that we know that once you taste the bitter waters, it leaves in your mouth an aftertaste. And that aftertaste extends beyond the moment. In fact, that's the definition of an aftertaste. It's something that continues on long after whatever it was in your mouth has been swallowed. And we can understand why it's called the Mei Meriva, the bitter waters, because it occurs right after a series of events that occurs in Moses' life that, of course, would leave any regular person bitter. And we see that Moses is forced to face one challenge after the next. First, it's the spies. Then it's the rebellion of Korach. Finally, Moses' sister passes away, and there's no water. And so you can imagine Moses turning to God at this moment in the story and saying, I didn't ask for this job. In fact, one step further, I begged not to have this job. And so you can see after one occurrence after another, Moses is confronted by a bitter people that eventually rubs off on him. And he must have said so many times, at least under his breath, as maybe many of us did when we were children, why are they always picking on me? It's a phrase that you recognize. And it says it so clearly in this morning's Parsha, Vayikalu al Moshe ve'al Aaron, Vayarev ha'am im Moshe, that we see the water, the community was without water, and they joined against Moses and Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moshe, Vayikalu al Moshe, Vayerav ha'am im Moshe. They just kept picking on him. No matter what he did for them, no matter how many times he came to battle for them, no matter how many times Moses stood in the breach between God and the Jewish people when God wanted to wipe them out, they just kept putting the screws to him. And they went on. If we had only died in Egypt, wouldn't it have been better had we gone back instead of dying out here in the wilderness? Why did you bring us out of Egypt to this wretched place, a place with no grain and figs or vines or pomegranates? There isn't even water to drink, say the Jewish people. And then to make matters worse, Moses is instructed to speak to the rock, and in fact he hits the rock. Lachein lo taviu et hakahal hazeh el eretz asher natati lahem. And God responds to this by saying, guess what? You're not going in now, Moses. I told you to speak to the rock, and you hit the rock, and because of that, you're not going into the land of Israel. Because, says God, you didn't trust me. Moses could have easily responded to that moment, I really wasn't listening carefully. There were too many people chirping in my ear. But God says the lesson you taught the Jewish people in that moment was, don't trust in God. Trust in me. Saying God to Moses, they will have confused you for me, says God. Lachein lo taviu et hakahal hazeh el eretz asher natati lahem. Therefore, you're not going into the land that I promised them. And you can hear Moses saying, even though it's not in the text, you can hear him say, but it wasn't my fault. It's them. They're the bitter ones, not me. They're the ones who caused this circumstance, not me. God says, but guess what? You're not going into the land of Israel. And you can almost hear Moses say, I'm not going into the land of Israel? Me? How can that possibly be? Look at this people. They don't belong there. Rashi then teaches us something so beautiful. Moses is having a crisis of faith. Just as the people didn't have faith in God and they were swallowed up by the earth, just as the people didn't have faith in God and they died in a plague of 14,000 people in last week's Parsha, Kidei shelo yomru alehem ke'avon dor hamidbar shenigzar lehem shelo yikansu. Rashi says they didn't get to go in either. People who have a crisis of faith can never envision a promised land. So too, says Rashi, Kach haya avon Moshe ve'Aharon. Moses and Aaron's sin was that they allowed themselves to catch the disease of bitterness. The bitterness of the Korach rebellion. The bitterness of the people who got swallowed up by the earth or who died in the plague was given over to Moses. Moses caught the bitterness. And bitter leaders can't lead. And then we see that the waters begin to flow. And then in the very next sentence, the waters are named. Hema mei meriva asher ravu b'nei Yisrael et Adonai v'yikadesh bam. The waters began to flow, but guess what? They tasted bitter. It had a bitter aftertaste because a quarrelsome people with a bitter leader will only taste bitter water. It's almost the exact same language I want you to know about that Naomi uses in the book of Ruth. Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, has horrible tragedy befall her. You know this story. Her husband, Elimelech, dies. Her two sons, Machlon and Kilion, both die. Vatomer alehem al tikra'ana li Naomi. And when she returns home, back to where everybody knows her and everybody's saying, Naomi, you've come back. She says, Karan li Mara. Don't call me Naomi anymore. I've changed my name to Mara because I'm bitter. I'm bitter because of the lot that I have been dealt. And she does something that the Torah does in this morning's parsha. She names it. It's important in life for us to name those things that make us bitter. You'll never move on from what makes you bitter until you first name it. And then you can begin to move on. Now, I don't think it's coincidence that the very next scene that we have in this morning's parsha is that Moses wants to move on. Literally, physically, Moses wants to move the Jewish people on. From one camp to another camp, from one place to another place. But let's read it metaphorically for a minute and suggest that what Moses really wants is for the Jewish people and maybe even himself to move on from the bitterness. He named it. He found it. He understood it. He internalized it. And then he says it's time to move on. Name it and move on, he says to the Jewish people. But then something remarkable happens. The king he asks permission to move on says no. Because guess what? We don't need permission from somebody else to move on. We have to give it to ourselves. And it's not until we give it to ourselves that we'll ever move on. It's not going to come from somebody else. It's not going to be from somebody else who says, guess what? Your grieving is now over. It's not going to happen because someone tells you to do it. It's going to happen when you decide to do it yourself. Quite literally, Moses begs to let the Jewish people, Moses begs to let himself move on. But guess what? Moses never goes in because he doesn't learn the lesson that it has to come from himself. The message is simple. And the lesson comes from Moshe Rabbeinu. We never refer to Moses as Moshe Navinu, our prophet. We refer to Moshe as our teacher. Yeah, we say, Lo kam b'Yisrael Navi ki Moshe. There was never another prophet like Moses, but we always refer to Moshe as Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, because he's always instructing us. King of Edom says, no, you can't move on. Moses should have said, I'll move on when I'm ready to move on. And I don't need permission from you. There's a funny story. A wife comes home from work. She had an awesome day. An amazing day. She accomplished so much. She walks in the house. She's greeted by her husband, and her husband just launches into the worst day he probably ever had. This went wrong. That went wrong. The list of things that went wrong goes on and on. Next thing you know, the wife is complaining about how terrible her commute was. You know it. You've been in this circumstance in which you have had a great day, but somebody else's bad day got all over you. I learned an interesting phrase that I've only used once before, but I want you to hear it because it's so true. You can look at life as if it is a glass half full, or you can look at life as if it's a glass half empty. But the best way to look at life is as if the glass can always be refilled. Shabbat shalom. We continue with Musaf, page 184.